It is your buddy, Peace and Harmony with you here today. Much love going out to all the beautiful empowered harmonizers. It has been a busy day here in the Peace and Harmony studios. And we are zooming in and focusing in today on a great viewer question, and that is to understand the covert abuse, the manipulation, and the withdrawal of attention that we see pervasive of a covert narcissist relationship. Now, a covert narcissist is very tricky, very sly. They're kind of like a fox trotting in the woods. They look, fairly benign. They can oftentimes have a great demeanor, a great carriage, a great way that they hold or present themselves. Yet underneath, there's sort of a sense of an entitlement. The slyness that tends to kind of ladder up within their personality that makes them seemingly strong and impenetrable, but this can actually be a flaw. This sort of impenetrable aspect, the covert narcissist, you will never see them vulnerable. You'll very rarely, either male or female, kind of see them shed a tear. Oftentimes you don't know their true feelings. And that is what's so difficult to detect and so very hurtful of a covert narcissist, is because they don't really wear their feelings, their clarity, their clear communication on their sleeve. They have something about them that is sort of mystifying or mysterious, and this might be kind of like the attractor factor that you have with them. You might be kind of attracted by the sort of mysterious angle or perspective that they tend to carry about themselves. Not only in a withdrawal, but there's sort of an aloofness, meaning that they're really kind of checked out, or they're not really kind of there. They're just sort of absent. And not just like an absent-minded professor where they're like, you kind of know what they're focusing on, you kind of know what their purpose is about, you kind of know what their specialty is, and they're just sort of, absent-minded and doing something, just that is endearing about them. Aloofness meaning that they are really sort of withholding, tight-lipped. There's not a sort of a guard down about them. There's always a guard up. And it's not always in a very physical way where there's a physical feeling that they're, really domineering and strong. It's more the fact that they don't share. They keep very tight-lipped. They keep very buttoned up. And once again, this aspect about them might be maybe what you originally fell in love with, or that you kind of excuse away. And so it's important to note that this is what ends up depriving you, or what is the core of the issue that presents itself in the relationship. The fact that this person can't lay down their sword. The fact that they can't be vulnerable. The fact that you don't know where they're coming from. The fact that you don't really see what's going on underneath the surface. It's kind of like a steely, iced over pond, if you will. You kind of see the ice. You don't see the sea life, the aquamarine life that is underneath. You kind of see just the outer shell, the outer surface. And this also tends to, what I feel, puts others in a shell as well. In other words, through the law of reciprocity and that understanding that energetically you must be a match in order to survive or continue in the relationship. Eventually, it's almost like through osmosis, or through a way of just trying to get along with them, you must adopt a sort of shell-like demeanor. In other words, there's not a lot of in-depth stuff, heart-to-heart stuff that you can really get to. They're not going to expose themselves. They're not going to really share with you their feelings. You might, they might tell you, feelings are for sissies, or they just don't seem to be very emotionally intelligent. But there's an intellectual capacity to this as well, in that they're kind of keeping tabs of things in order to keep a leg up for themselves. So a leg up, meaning they're always trying to do one better. And in this sort of ivory tower, if you will, there's always going to be a sense that they are demure or captivating if they're a female, yet you really don't know kind of the smugness, the sort of evil plotting that can kind of come, in other words, they're one way to your face, they're another way in other public circles. So privately, they might be one way, but then publicly they tend to flip on a dime. And when you see this, you're like, oh my God, like this, once you've exposed it, you have no more doubt. But it is sort of, it's putting others in a shell. It's putting others in a way of sort of a false relating. In other words, you have to swallow your pride oftentimes with a covert narcissist because they're not going to validate you. They're not going to give you the compliments. They're not going to just give you sort of the small talk. They're not going to acknowledge you or validate you. Why? Is it going to get them, would it get them in trouble? Is it, would it make them look bad? It's really all about the fact that this covert narcissist needs to maintain a sense of superiority. That is their authority and control that they have over themselves. So they have the right to be whoever they are. So a covert narcissist, we don't want to judge them. We don't want to say, good, bad, or indifferent. We're just trying to look at the facts. So it's very important for you to be objective and put some structure on how you understand it. Because if it's just all over the place and you're just feeling hurt or emotionally distraught from them, then you are the victim here. And it's a goal of the Peace and Harmony channel here is to not, play the victim role time and time again. Haven't you played that role enough? Don't you want to try out for something else in the school play other than victim? Isn't there someone else about you who really wants to come out on top, who wants to win on your goals, your objectives? Being strong, being self-reliant, being resistant, not having to be put up with this sort of mistreatment. But it's very difficult to detect because it's not always on the outward treatment. You can't always put a finger on what it is they did. It's what they don't do. It's the withholding of sort of a validation that keeps people always in the lynch, in the lurk, and then adopting a shell, a way of relating to them, oftentimes which is, it feels ingenuine, but it can be very codependent in its result, meaning that you have to swallow a lot of pride. You're not getting a certain affection from them. You're not getting a certain honesty. You're not getting you're not emotionally naked, as I say, with them. They're not going to be made vulnerable. To them, the way that they feel it is that they're just strong. It's one ear out the other. It's not their job. It's not their role. But it keeps them in sort of a fortress, a selfish fortress, because they're not giving others the time of day. They're not giving others a specific type of communication. It's a lack of communication. It's a communication breakdown specifically because of a lack of empathy. And if they don't have to communicate with you, then they're only responsible and accountable to themselves. If they were to openly acknowledge you and validate you and give, credit where credit is due, to them that feels intimidating. It feels like it's not their job, that they must always keep a leg up and maintain that sense of superiority, that sense that they are the one and only. This is how they distinguish themselves. This is how they maintain the scene, their status, who they are, what they're about, and what they're becoming is through this withholding. It gives them the right and the liberty to do as they see fit, as they need. It's all about their needs. It's never really about accommodating to others' needs. But as once you open up and you're vulnerable and you accommodate and being able to relate to others' needs, specifically through empathy, specifically through selflessness, specifically through altruism, that you actually grow as a person. And sometimes it's painful. Yeah, it's painful to set your needs aside or shelve them, while you're in this relationship. So the relationship can be very painful when you feel like you have, so much invested in them, or so much a part of you is with them, or you gave them kind of your best. And your best meaning your entire focus. You're you expect it to be taken at face value. Meaning that, what you gave through the law of reciprocity, you expect in return. In other words, the generosity of heart, not necessarily of gifts, because the covert narcissist, a lot of people feel a graciousness when they're with them. They can be very generous. The narcissist often is. In other words, they're going to, make you feel privileged, special, entitled, especially in the love bombing phase. They're going to make you feel that you're, maybe you have the chance to connect with them and to be, their one and only. Yet you have to kind of look at how this is never really played out. There's going to be a disconnect between, what they really ultimately do in the big picture and then what they give to you. In other words, but you can never, speak up for yourself. Oftentimes because, in the midst of the relationship, people oftentimes don't know to speak up for themselves. They don't know. They feel it's out of place. They tend to sort of adopt that shell, if you will. They're very difficult to confront, especially if you don't like confrontation. You're not going to be comfortable kind of registering your own voice. You're more about registering their needs than your own needs. So you're letting their needs dictate your decisions, your choices, and then your standards begin to get lower. And, as I say, and your boundaries begin to get diminished. It becomes all about them. Their needs become your needs. So that's really the core of codependency. When your needs are never sort of expressed at the forefront, they're never in tune with, in touch with, found out about. You don't get a chance to grow these, develop these, see into these, have these become real, substantial. It's always about, emptying yourself this out, this altruistic behavior. But this altruistic behavior, which means selfless or self-sacrificing, can get you into a lot of trouble. It can get you into poverty. It can get you into unhappiness. There's a lot of thankless people or people who are narcissistic who will take advantage of that good nature, that altruistic side. They will begin to see that they have you right where they want you, for they're only on their terms. And so their terms might be varying in relationships. So in other words, in the process of the relationship, you might find, where did you take care of them? In other words, it really ends up being about taking care of their narcissistic needs, their ego. And then so you need to shield their ego with your own self-debasement. In other words, what do you need to neglect in order to feed their ego? So there becomes a real detriment, a real sort of slow toxicity. And it's very difficult to call out because, it's people in the midst of it, they're not really in touch with that inner voice. They're all in the love swooning, in the attraction, or they're caught up in the fact that perhaps this person is the authority. They are the superior one. They do have a certain, authority about them that you must heed to, or, perhaps if it's a family member, you must show deference to this individual. In other words, you must defer to them as the authority. Otherwise, you're going to get your, what handed to you. And so you must have to put up and shut up. But then there's this sort of shell of a reaction, a shell of a person that people end up feeling, and it's very painful because you feel like, what you gave on the heart level was not reciprocated. And so really, there's a lot of layers and complexity to taking a look and understanding this. And to really become sensitized to yourself and your own needs and your own truth, which is really what you want. You necessarily don't want a relationship with a covert narcissist because it's not really ever going to be about you. You don't get a chance to be in that little center or spotlight with them. You always feel like you're a little bit in the shade. It's, if anything, you can get like a little toe in their sunshine, but they don't always validate you for the personality, the effervescence, the love, the, whatever it is. Oftentimes you probably have gone out of your way, and then they're going to hold this against you. If you stay with them long enough, you are overextending yourself. And so, it really is, it does become something of a mismatch with a covert narcissist when you are in this codependent sort of phase or constantly honing in and zeroing in on them. And so I wanted to bring up that element because it's very important to see the effect that is a result of this cause. So that's a big red flag of a covert narcissist, is this sort of, their feelings are under lock and key. They can't ever sort of let their guard down. You feel that they're always sort of bottled up. And yes, they have the right to be as they are, but yet, you can't really pull, their eye teeth out. You can't really beg for attention, but yet, you feel that, you're getting your attention. Oftentimes then in the dynamic, your attention becomes what you're giving them. So rather than getting attention about you and being able to really receive and coming out of that shell, it's more a dynamic where your needs are to take care of them. So that's really the core of codependency, is that there's this constant need that you have to take care of others' needs to feel whole. But yet there has to be this simultaneously, fulfillment of your needs. In other words, you need to know what you see is what you get. You need to know that this person isn't harboring all sorts of animosity or rage or mistreatment. It's like when the cannon's gonna blow. So there's this sort of feeling of an impenetrable armor, I would say, about them, which oftentimes people can find very charming. But the problem is that there's this uneven slope, where it's like it always has to be with them on the up. They have the leg up, you're on the down. And yet, even if you have all sorts of accomplishments, you might be telling them, I've got, $5 million homes, still there's something they're going to bring up about you, or there's a feeling that they're going to try to push your buttons, that they're not going to see your accomplishments. They're not going to be able to validate that. To them, it is intimidating. They don't want to level the playing field. They don't want to be on equal. They must always, have their foot in they always want to grind their own heels in. They're the ones with, the running spikes in the relationship, an emotional spike ready to spike you out, because, it's just, if it is provided, it's oftentimes very superficial, or what's the word that I'm looking for? It's just sort of, let me just think here. Gratuitous. In other words, it doesn't feel very genuine. It feels like they can't express themselves. If they don't have an empathy, empathy, and when you think about what you really get passionate about, oftentimes isn't empathy. There's a feeling, an inspiration, what love is, there's a feeling of respect, admiration, awe. There's something that you really like about this person. They help you become animated. They help you become energized. They help you to be expressive. They help you to grow yourself. In other words, you can be yourself and all about you, and they're not threatened by things being all about you. In fact, they like to hear from you. They want, they want to know that you're doing great and that you're happy. The covert narcissist, if they want to hear about you, it's always on a very superficial level. And it's always kind of on a condition. In other words, well, at least you're making me look good here by you doing this, is kind of the insinuation there. So it's a very, very bizarre sort of situation. And so when you really are trying to relate with them, it can be very, very strange, in that, because, again, there's this feeling of being a shell in a relationship that I wanted to address. It is the cause of this lack of empathy which has created this effect. And a lot of people are very uncomfortable being in a shell relationship, being in a false relationship, being hardened by this type of person. They want to be able to let it all hang out. They want to be able to let it go. They want to be able to speak their mind with this person and get an honest answer or honest dialogue. The sad thing is when they keep so much hidden, and then then at some point you have to become like a detective and try to get beyond the layers of what they're hiding, and you might find certain things where they are not forthright with you, not forthcoming with information. They might lie. They might keep some things hidden. Alcohol, food, contacts, websites, pornography, business deals, relationships. There's not this sort of communication, especially when it's in a relationship where this is required. If you're in an intimate relationship, if it's going to be serious, if it's a marriage, if it's, it needs to be like kind of out there. You need to be able to be together and be known as such. You don't want to feel like you're a dust blowing in the wind, when they're, in public. You want to feel like you're a person. So people feel very dehumanized by this. It is because of a need for a covert narcissist to lack validating of others who require it, who deserve it, who it's more than obvious. And, those people then oftentimes end up suffering, being either very uncomfortable receiving a compliment, being very uncomfortable having to go through a lot of life lessons in order to, repair this sort of deficit, feeling that they have a deficit or a damage or a hurt there, and being able to let that go. And so just continue to radiate and acknowledge and recognize this in you, that you can, come out of your shell. You don't have to be that person that they're trying to paint you into. You can, come and blossom from within. You can be the genuine you, the authentic you, the one that smiles, sings, dances, or takes a nap. I mean, whatever it is that's about you, just you being yourself and the values that you hold, and getting the respect that way. You shouldn't have to give this up and sort of be objectified, because there's sort of a very objectified feeling people can experience. Sort of being on an outward show. You feel like something is not firing on all cylinders with this relationship, and oftentimes that's what it is. The covert narcissist needs to keep a leg up, a one up, just to keep them in a position of power and control. So it's a very sort of subtle way of doing this, but please don't feel bad for too long. Put some structure on, what you're going through. Being able to label it and identify it and say, aha, I get it. And then allowing yourself to process it so you don't feel forever that you're ruminating and wondering if it is you did something wrong. It's just an experience that comes from this type of relationship. And I think you know better now. And once you kind of get this, you can move on and surround yourself with people who get you for who you are and love you for who you are. This is your buddy, Peace and Harmony, with you here today. And I hope that these videos do help. Please share and please subscribe for more great tools, videos, discussion, and support.